Good day, everybody. I feel kind of half intimidated looking at all these qualified people out there. My club mate and ex-teammate, Mickey Whelan, here in front of me, watching every move to make sure this fella doesn't tell any lies. I will require a little bit of poetic license somewhere along the line. But it is nice to be here. Hopefully I won't bore you too much. I'll try and just tell every 15 minutes. The title of my talk seems to be changing, but I'll try and keep up with the moves. I hope I won't bore you too much. I'll do my best just to say, realistically, I suppose like all sportsmen, it's a journey where I've been, what I've come through, and hopefully where I am. As the late John B. Keane said one time famously, I'm in favour of long sermons myself. You're waking up very refreshed after them. So realistically, I suppose my story begins with the Christian Brothers in Griffith Avenue. As I always say, you play the game that's nominated by the school. That's where myself and my three brothers found ourselves. I lived in Clontarf. We came up Griffith Avenue. I obviously was a very keen sportsman, or inclined that way. In the early days, I got involved with the local school team. Now, this was a Christian Brothers school of maybe 300 or 400 boys, and you very quickly learned the rules of survival. Going back to the football aspect of it, I remember at lunchtime, the yard was full of maybe 100 boys, and they kicking, at that time, a tennis ball or two tennis balls up and down the yard. And realistically, you had to be of some ability to get your hands on that tennis ball. And it taught you at an early stage the rules of survival and the rules of competition. Then moved on to the school team, and I can realistically say, you know, for a Christian Brothers school of that nature, being elected to play and represent the school was a gladiatorial role that I didn't experience anymore at later stages of my sporting career. To be able to get onto that bus with 200 boys following you and off to the Phoenix Park, it was, I mean, 5 or 6 CIE buses would pull up outside the school in Griffith Avenue, and it was realistically kind of gladiatorial status, and that's where the whole thing began. Moved then on into the other schools, which I'll come to in a minute, but and then on into, which was my club, which I'm going to bore you by talking about here today, St. Vincent's. Now, then moved into the county situation, and then moved into where I went after that. I think we'll move on to, Niall, the next slide there. The disadvantage of men not knowing the past is that they do not know the present. History is a hill or a high point, a vantage from which alone men can see the town in which they live, or the age in which they are living. Or alternatively, you can say, how can you know the future if you don't know the past? So that's what I propose to start with and say, look, this is the situation, this is where I came from, this is what I went through, and as I say, this is where I am. Now, the St. Vincent story, all through my sporting career, I had a kind of internal belief, confidence, and expectation. I always felt self-confident on the field. I always felt that we were going to be supported. I always felt that there was an expectation that you would win. Now, what was that all built on? Well, the club was founded in 1931 by Father Fitzpatrick and Brother Fitzgerald. Part of the mission statement was to promote healthy and character-forming recreation and association for the youth of Dublin North East through the promotion of Gaelic games, culture and Irish language. Now you will see that Father Fitzpatrick was very with it at the time. He was politically correct. He said youth. He didn't distinguish between male or female. Then they went on to talk about the admission to, later on in 1947 motion, that admission to the membership of St. Vincent's shall be in the future be confined to persons who are eligible to play minor grades, or who were born in Dublin, or who on the date of application were ordinarily resident in the parishes of Marino, Fairview and Clontarf. That was a 1947 motion. Now, a lot of you there today would wonder what in the name of God was that all about. But realistically, what was happening in those days was that players would start off playing for Dublin. Then somewhere during the championship they would get a call to go and play for Monaghan, or go and play for Kilkenny, or go and play for Tipperary. They would then abandon their efforts in Dublin and go and play for those counties, so Dublin were left nowhere. Secondly, you had a situation where Dublin would win an All-Ireland final, maybe 1938, whatever, and they would be comprised of people who did not live in Dublin, who are not from Dublin, who are not going to stay in Dublin. So realistically, you had 15 players who got All-Ireland medals, but Dublin realistically got nothing out of it because there wasn't a continuing bond. So what was behind this motion was to establish a situation which was a deliberate promotion and a deliberate policy to establish native Dubliners to play the game, to represent Dublin, and hopefully to win at the highest level. That was what was behind that motion, and that's where St. Vincent started off. You'll see from the slide here, a club is an organic living thing which depends on community around it for its existence. Now, again, that was a specific objective and a mission statement. The club certainly developed, it certainly achieved, and it certainly provided services reciprocal to the communities that supported them. All young people required it at the time, and even more so today. Now, the GAA itself, as an organisation, has been criticised many times, including by me. But one thing you have to say they did get deadly right was that they started at the grassroots. And the yield from that operation has proven itself year in, year out, even up to today. Very few sports are exercised, and this comes from professionals of other disciplines, with the same passion as those attending our games here in Croke Park or all over the country nationally. If you require any evidence of what I'm talking about at the moment, you only have to revert back to Schlockneil in County Derry, or Mullinott this year. There's where the community, there's where the passion, there's where the existence is, and there's where the leadership comes from, at that level, upwards. The importance of schools. Well, realistically, in my time anyway, the schools provided the initial product. The Christian Brothers trained the people to this level. They were well adapted, they knew the basic rules, and then they were handed into the secondary schools, and then they were handed to the clubs at the same time. Now, the demise of the Religious and the Christian Brothers in the 70s did provide a problem for the game. It did provide a problem for the clubs, insofar as they now had to take on the role of, which I'm looking at now, providing coaching facilities themselves. Now, this was not an easy task, because you might consider it the task of providing people with the knowledge or art of playing games, but it also has a very psychological impact significance, insofar as you are now taking over young people that you have to look after and know what you're talking about. Significantly, you can't place young people in the hands of lunatics, if you want to use the word, who actually don't know what they're talking about themselves and are encouraging young people to do something that they wouldn't be prepared to do themselves. As Mickey Whelan will tell you there was a golden rule in the old days when you were in charge of senior teams, that you would never ask anybody to do something that you were not prepared to do yourself. So it all had to do with discipline on the field and discipline off the field. The importance of the schools, well, in the beginning of the St. Vincent's story, O'Connell schools and St. Joseph's in Fairview, they were, if you like, the providers of the raw talent, honed to a certain level and then handed into the clubs. The clubs then did what they could do with them, and you transferred into the county, into the provincial, and into anywhere else they went. St. Vincent's became a breeding ground then for champions, which is the subheading here. Now, given that they were only established in 1931, and given that my role is just to talk about St. Vincent's, and I apologize, I don't mean to imply that nobody else was successful, but that's my brief just for today. They were established in 1931. They made their big breakthrough into senior championship in 1949. Tom Humphreys describes the 1949-1959 age as the golden age for St. Vincent's. They practically made the senior football championship their own, losing only once to the students in Drumcondra in 1956 final. You move on then to the solidification, maturation of that team. And it raised the barrier to such an extent that in 1953, they won the National Football League final against Cavan, who were the previous year's All-Ireland champions. That day, in 1953, they wore the St. Vincent's jerseys because there were 14 players from St. Vincent's on that team. The goalkeeper, I think O'Grady was his name, played for the Air Corps. Air Corps now has a resonance with the present regime. They went on then to play the All-Ireland final in 1955. Now, 55 has a great significance insofar as this, more than anything, represented the rural versus the city. 55 Dublin team were the city slickers, if you like, who were going to take on Kerry. They were the imagination and excitement over this game was enormous. I don't remember too much about it, but I'm satisfied that it was. Now, they allegedly say that there were over 100,000 people got into the game, illegally as well as everything else. And the disappointment was ferocious because, for a start, Dublin lost 3 of their big, strong physical men due to appendicitis, injuries, and everything else before the game. But it was the traditional, as they say, Dublin versus the presenting as the slick, fast, moving team versus what they call the catch and kick crowd. Colloquially, it was referred to as the fish and chips versus the bacon and cabbage. Now, one can't say enough about this, how in such a short period they reached up to the heights that they did. The disappointment in 55 was significant. They moved on then to 1958. Kevin Heffernan was the captain that day. They won the All-Ireland final in 1958. In fact, they won the All-Ireland minor final in 1958. St. Vincent's presented that day with 18 All-Ireland medals between minor and senior, which was no small achievement for a club that had only started out so many years before in 1931. Significantly, they moved on then to 1961, and I'm not excluding hurling from this talk because hurling was nearly my first game, and I loved hurling. I found it very exciting, and I thought it has come back to its own now and proved its worth. 1961, Dublin, as they say, whoever remembers who came second, they nearly won the All-Ireland hurling final in 1961. They were beaten by a point when they looked like they were going to win the game. That defeat, personally, I believe, is a psychological blockage in the mind of Dublin hurlers ever since. hopefully we will cross that barrier soon, as we have improved enormously in the last few years. Now, 1955, moved into 58, moved into 63. Again, Des Foley, the two Foley brothers, they were St. Vincent's men. Des Foley was with Mickey Whelan, the 1963 team. Lar Foley was a character unto himself, and they won in 63 and didn't come again until 1974. You know about the 70s, and I'll say something about that later on. And they've moved on then into 80, 90, and now into the present time. Now, there's a subheading there, transforming our games. As I said, the 55 was a kind of movement from the slick movement, slick passing, slick players against the catch and kick. The game of hurling has obviously, 15 years ago, people were very worried that hurling would extinguish itself insofar as, there were about 7 teams were playing the game, and it didn't expand to anybody else. But the last 2 years or 3 years now have proven that hurling is the game. Hurling is the audience. Hurling is the marketable quantity that the GAA have. And if you require any the game has transformed itself in so many ways, let alone coaching and training. But I remember a quotation from Des Foley one time, and he said, somewhere in the 60s, he walked into the dressing room in Croke Park for the final of the Railway Cup, which is now gone, but it was a big competition in those days. He said the first 3 people he saw sitting on the bench were Pa Connolly from Kildare, Paddy McCormick from Offaly, and John Timmins. He said, I took one look. He said, I didn't know whether I was in Croke Park or the Coombe Hospital, he said. I remember another man I met, and I'm talking about the transference of coaching and training. Another man I met, not through football, but I knew him very well, was the late Paddy Vaughan Brosnan, who played for Kerry. Now, Paddy Vaughan was a man that had his own ideas on fitness and training and first aid and all the rest of it. He spoke at length about this new invention, which he called hamstrings. And he was explaining to me, while I'm thinking in my own head, Paddy, your crowd never had hamstrings because they never moved fast enough to have a hamstring. But I didn't obviously say it to him. Now, Paddy had his own ideas too. He said, there was first aid in my time, Tony. He said, I remember in the Munster final against Cork one day, he said, I got a blow into the face. He said, my nose was broken. I'm not sure whether it was a knee, a fist, a head, or what. But he said, I ran over to the sideline and my chest was covered in blood and my face, and he said, I always remember the first aid, he said. A selector of the Kerry team, he said, tore out a sheet of paper from the Kerry man, rolled it in a ball, shoved it up my nose, and they just shoved me back out there again. I didn't see the doctor for 2 days after that. So things have certainly improved and changed insofar as the game is concerned in that regard. Now, just to show that it was how change has taken place, I was taken by a little something I saw in one of the manuals, and it was a commentary on St. Joseph's. In the clip here shows the Guards versus St. Vincent's. Now, such was the excitement in those days. That match you're just looking at there, that was a club match, and there were 22,000 came to that game. The Guards and the Vincents were famously opposed to one another for all the reasons that you can imagine. Vincents had a big support in those days. But the clip I'm talking about was just to show you the change that has taken place in the game. It was, and this was Mark Yu from a reporter from the Irish Times. He said, in 1952, when Vincents were busily trying to keep their position, said it was the business as usual. St. Joseph's was East Wall, and don't forget East Wall was the docking area of Dublin, which there were a lot of serious characters down there. offered the traditional challenge in the quarter-finals of the Senior Football Championships. And the game, which started 15 minutes late after a manhunt for a referee, and I could well imagine why, was described as this is the Irish Times now, was described as a mixture of spasmodic football, frequent wrestling, occasional fisticuffs, with many deliberate fouls and some interference by the sideline inspectors. Now, the rule change personnel will have a lot to do to kind of compete with that if such were the rules today. Now, maybe we've gone to the other end of the spectrum now today, I don't know. But certainly, I'm just saying it in passing that football is in a bit of trouble at the moment and requires a lot of attention. The next.
The north side of Dublin presents a busy scene from early in the morning on September the 26th. People from all over Ireland and from further afield head for Croke Park, for this is All-Ireland Football Final Sunday.
Yes. And in the run-up to the 1955 final, this was billed as the defining game in Gaelic games history. And to a certain extent it was, between the old style, as portrayed by Kerry, catch and kick, and the new modern thinking of Gaelic football as a slick, fast-moving, well-thought-out game.
I think that is, well, I think that saw not the end, but it started the end of Bishop's throwing in the ball. Because Kevin nearly took Bishop ball and all and just thrown in.
You had to get special permission to go to Trinity from the Archbishop of their time. And the Archbishop in Dublin in the early 1950s was the redoubtable Dr. John Charles McQuaid. Nowadays, the Catholic faith makes up the vast majority, I would imagine, of the Trinity student population. And that might never have happened but for people, iconic leaders like Heffernan.
Now, obviously, you're aware of change. We've come a long way, with no disrespect, we've come a long way from the Bishop throwing in the ball now. A lot of changes have taken place very, very swiftly. We have to cope with the change and try and provide for the needs of the youth today. The last video there, which shows Kevin Heffernan smoking. Kevin was an inveterate smoker. If he had a fault, it was his smoking. I remember after the 1965 All-Ireland football final, which Dublin lost, which Kerry won and Dublin lost, for reasons we best know. And the story goes that Heffernan walked into a shop 2 days later. He asked for 20 Afton, and the shopkeeper said, "Is it not 20 players you require?" Heffernan spent some time in Trinity in TCD, which I did myself. You very quickly learn that there are other cultures to be addressed. You very quickly learn that you have to be able to defend your own political side of things, and you very quickly learn that you have to exercise compassion and understanding of other people's position. Now, I think Irish society is changing very fast at the moment, and this will be brought about one way or the other. So people will have to show a certain understanding and compassion, which can be enveloped into what you'd call development also. The next clip there, as I said, the change is fast happening, and the GAA are going to have to, like the clubs, going to have to cope with it, because we are in a very kind of competitive atmosphere at the moment where we have to compete with all games appearing on TV and all the rest of it. So, as I said, I'm firmly of the opinion that football has to change for the better. hurling has to maintain itself, which has reached the zenith, and we all have to kind of compete with whatever you want to use term, other sports or other disciplines, which comes back down to the coaching as well as most importantly. Okay, slide 13 there is headed 1966-1972. That mostly relates to what was going on in Vincent's, but also more particularly what was going on in Dublin. Now, in case anybody would be misguided enough to think that the 1974 was something that happened in 1974 and that it all, I mean, Dublin, in 1974, you'd have gotten 1,000 to 1 against them, even getting to the final, let alone winning the final. But that started way back in maybe 68, 69, maybe earlier, when Dublin, I remember playing on Dublin teams, and year on, we couldn't beat Kildare, we couldn't beat Westmeath, we couldn't beat Longford, you couldn't beat Laois, you couldn't beat Louth. In fact, we rarely got past the second round of the Leinster Championship. Now, I in particular couldn't understand this because I was playing against all the same personnel here in Dublin. They were all in Dublin clubs. But it seemed when we went out, played in the Leinster Championship, put on a blue jersey, something changed. Now, I don't know what that change was. Well, I suspect I know what it was, but that was the nature of the situation at the time. So suddenly in 1974 it took off, which I'll come to now again, and where we developed after that. In fact, in 1973, I remember, I think we were in Division 2. We were billeted to play Kilkenny, if you can believe that, in the National Football League. We arrived down in Nolan Park, and there were 10,000 people at the game. But unfortunately for us, 9,998 were there to see the Kilkenny minor hurling final, Dixborough versus somebody else. By the time we got onto the field, there were about 20 disinterested people hanging around, and none by the time the game ended. So things have changed remarkably since then. I remember Paddy Grace, who was the chairman of the Kilkenny County Board at the time, saying to Jimmy Gray, look, take the points, we're not interested one way or another. And Gray trying to impress upon him, this is a National League game. He said, you just can't take the points. Getting on to hurling there, I remember with a Kilkenny connection, I remember a great story about a man called Pad Dillon. Now, Dillon played full-back for Kilkenny, was a formidable figure. He was, and you can translate this whatever way you like, he was what the late Michael O'Hare would call a robust player. After retirement, he had a friend up in County Derry, I think it was Dungiven, and the friend prevailed upon him to bring his club team from Kilkenny up to Dungiven to play the Derry fellas. They went anyway, and the game got underway, and it soon proved that the Kilkenny crowd were a little bit too sharp for their Derry counterparts. At half-time, obviously, somebody told the Derry crowd to get stuck in, to use an expression, which they did. And the Kilkenny fellas retaliated. Unfortunately, the game ended without anybody being too seriously injured. At the so-called social afterwards, somebody approached Dillon, he being the man with all the All-Ireland medals in his back pocket, to inquire what he thought of the standard of the Derry players. And his response allegedly was, I'd say a new ball would last you a long time up here, he said. Now, dedication. Now, under the photograph there, you'll see, on the clip there, you'll see dedication, the two Foley brothers. Well, they certainly were dedicated, and they were great characters. Lar Foley, the elder brother, was a real character. Des was I think the only man ever. Now, these days you wouldn't understand the significance of the Railway Cup. It was an opportunity for players from so-called lesser counties to play at an important senior level in Croke Park on St. Patrick's Day. Des Foley both the Foleys were farmers. Des Foley, I think, was the only man that went out first and played hurling, and secondly changed and went out and played in the football final immediately after it. Larry Foley was a man who was recognised all over the country for his worth, went on to train the Dublin hurling team and coach the Dublin hurling team, and was a formidable character by any standards. I was just telling Nicky Whelan earlier on there, Lar, like a lot of very hardy proponents of any game, and I'm just like Mike Tyson, he had this kind of effeminate kind of tone in his voice. I don't know why. But we had a fellow playing for us one time called Eugene Mullen. And like a lot of North County people, once they get your name mispronounced, they never change. You know, no, his name is Paddy Hallinan. I know, Paddy Hanlon. But okay, you give up at that stage, you say. But he used to talk, I heard him shouting out at Eugene Mullen, and he couldn't pronounce the word Eugene. He always said Eugene. And somebody said, but hearing him shouting out, saying, Eugene, pick up your man. He said, did somebody not tell him that the pronunciation was Eugene? Somebody said, no. He said, everybody else was shouting, Eugene, pick up your man. Now, the dedication obviously was there from the 1950s. I mean, the 1950s team, they trained, they played, and there was very little in their life, as some of them admitted to me, except getting married and so on. I think only one person on the 1950s team took a drink. As the late John Timmins, afterwards, player there with Mickey, said he knew most about the opposition because they were the only fellas he could go for a drink with after the match. What'll I say? The dedication is obvious. It was there in the 50s. It was certainly there in the 70s. And I'll just tell one short story. I don't like telling stories about myself. One short story about dedication. On the 1st of September 1979, I took the team up to Santry, which was our training headquarters at that stage. We went through a training session for an hour and a half or so about. I left, I went home, and then I went down to the Pro Cathedral and I got married at 3 o'clock. So that is maybe a little extreme, but that is the dedication that's required to succeed at that level. Now, I'm being hurried on here, so I'll move on. And now, providing leadership, all you've got to look at the personnel, and you'll see, you know, Dan O'Mahony in the 50s, Kevin Heffernan, Des and Lar Foley, Dr. Pat O'Neill. As they say, Pat O'Neill didn't come from St. Vincent's. They said he just thought like and played like somebody from St. Vincent's. Mullins, Mickey Whelan, David Hickey, Pat Gilroy, Gay O'Driscoll, Robbie Doyle. There's a list there, and a lot of them originated in what started in 1931. Now, I thought there was a video there on this awful video. As we used to say, this was bad for us, but great for Paddy Cullen. He's lived on it ever since. In fact, it was a fateful day for me, because as a result of the whole thing, I wound up getting suspended for 7 months after it, something I said about a referee a month after the game. Now, also I remember after the hearing, and I'll finish now as quickly as I can, after the hearing in Croke Park one day, there was a photograph of me the next day coming out, a photograph in the Sunday Independent coming out of Croke Park. And there was a report on the whole issue, which was very contentious in the GAA at the time and became a serious PR risk, settled by Central Council after a while. I didn't serve the 7 months. But beside it was a report on an IRA bank raid. And I don't know whether the compositor did this deliberately or not, but down towards the end of the 2 columns, in the end of my column was, shots were exchanged and 2 special branch men were taken to hospital. Mike Murphy at 8 o'clock the next morning was reading this out on the program and said, the GAA take these things very seriously, don't they? Now, just values. You know, I do think, and I'm speaking to you guys now as coaches who probably know a lot more than me. I just went through the battlefields. Sport is a precursor for life. I think you learn all the lessons very quickly that you're going to face in afterlife. I think, you know, the same trials and tribulations requiring courage, compassion, patience, psychological strength, and demands. And sport in some way, as an early precursor, teaches you how to deal with all these things. I think Father Fitzpatrick said at one stage there, I hope that St. Vincent's will bring into their lives and into their lives of the nation the qualities they developed during their playing membership of the club and qualities of courage, resourcefulness, punctuality, and reliability. Well now, given the society we have today, that almost sounds innocent, but it's certainly true. And added together, you have a far more serious problem on your hands to deal with the stresses that are in everyday life today. The future is a subheading there, and I'm just saying from my own point of view, with respect, the future must be built on belief, dedication, hard work, patience, respect, and compassion. More than ever today, young people need direction and guidance. Sport is a great equalizer, providing the answers to the challenges in afterlife. Now, I'm going to use an old maxim here, which is very relevant to all you people sitting down here, and has been very relevant to Ireland in the last 10 years. The old saying is, you never see the spokes until the wheel is stopped. Now, the clubs are the spoke. The people in the clubs are the spokes. The members are the spokes. It's all very well to talk about the game at the elevated level of whatever. But if the GAA as an association don't provide for and cater for the clubs, the personnel to be trained, the coaches, then they will be found very seriously wanting, because there's no place for an elitist game and it will not survive. So I'm just saying to you people, you guys are the spokes in the wheel, and that's what has to be done. Just quickly, I'll wrap up by saying it has some reward being involved as I did. I remember one time being kind of forced into going down to see Michael Jackson in Páirc Uí Chaoimh. I went with bad grace. I was forced to go by my spouse and her friend. I had to drive from South Kerry all the way over to Páirc Uí Chaoimh, which is no idle trip, only to find out when I was going through the tunnel that the guy said to me, "These tickets are for last night." So, tempered as I was at the time, I said, "Listen, I don't even effing well want to be here. Now, why would I be here tonight for tickets that I had for last night?" So we had a fairly colourful exchange before he said, "You'll have to back out of the tunnel." So then I faced the two ladies who, under no circumstances, were they leaving. So while we were having this heated discussion anyway, I heard this voice saying, "Tony, is that you?" I looked through another tunnel, and here was Kid Galvin, who used to be the rub man for the Cork County football team. He said, "Come in." He said, "Sure, there's no problem." Then he looked at the tickets and he said, "Sure, they're rubbish." He said, "I'll bring you up to the top here." Which he did. And I'm just saying, these things happen. Finally, I'll finish on one story about Dr. Con Murphy from Cork as well. Dr. Con Murphy was, and the story connects with another great coach, a friend of Mike Whelan there, and Billy Morgan. A man of passion, if nothing else. And the story goes about 1988, I think, was the year they played Meath in the final. They were winning by a point when Paddy Sugru from Kerry was the referee. And Dr. Con Murphy had given a great speech about injuries, ankles and knees and everything else, when some fella put up his hand and said, "Tell me, Dr. Murphy, I would like to congratulate you on your speech and all the rest of it, but tell me, did you ever actually save anybody's life on the field?" Well, he said in 1988, Cork played Meath. Paddy Sugro gave Meath a free in the last minute, which was highly questionable, to tie the game, which Cork lost the replay. He said, Con Murphy said, the first thing I did was I turned and I jumped on Billy Morgan. He said, because Paddy Sugro would definitely have died that day. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't bore you too much.